Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to walk you through how to build a floating deck. In case you missed it, I made an entire video on designing your floating deck and the things to consider before you break ground. I cover how to determine the size of your deck, direction of decking and framing, how to determine deck height and the layout of your deck. I will link that video in the description below. I recommend watching it before you start building. In this video, I cover how to frame a floating deck. After the deck is framed, we plan to install Trex composite decking, and I'll have a separate tutorial for that. In the description below, you'll find some of the main tools and materials that I used, and if you would be so kind, hit subscribe if you found this video helpful. It's something small that you can do to help my channel in a big way. Let's take a quick look at the framing plan. I designed our deck in SketchUp. It's a great tool for planning your layout and dimensions. We are digging 3 trenches, then using concrete deck blocks and paver base for the foundation of our floating deck. We will frame the deck directly on the deck blocks. The overall dimension of our deck is 24 feet 4.5 inches by 16 feet. The floating deck is not attached to the house, it's right next to it. We're using treated 2x8 lumber in 16-foot and 12-foot lengths for the framing. We're using 16-foot boards for the center joist, rim joists, and to double up the cantilevered ends here. The interior joists are 12 feet long and placed 16 inches on center, with deck blocks under each joist. The center framing member has deck blocks about every 4 feet. Blocking will be installed in between every joist with some additional blocking along the cantilevered ends. We'll secure joist hangers under every joist. In my previous deck design video, I go over some resources that you can use to design your deck and where you can find estimated costs, so be sure to check that video out. Depending on the size of deck that you're going to build, your framing probably won't look exactly like mine, so do your research and consult a professional to solidify your deck design. I mentioned this in the first video and I'll say it again, I'm not a structural engineer or architect or licensed contractor, so before designing and building your own deck, be sure to consult a professional to make sure your design is structurally sound. Now that we have the design down, we can break ground. Step 1 is to prep your area. We used to have a ton of old, cracked concrete in this area, but we had a company come in and remove the concrete for us, so thankfully we only had to dig up a tiny corner of sod. Take a rough measurement of where you want your deck to go and remove any grass or debris from the area. Home Depot or Lowe's have sod cutting tools for rent if you're needing to remove sod in a large area. If you're building a deck near your house like us, take this time to slightly grade the dirt away from the house for drainage. If you're building your deck in your yard away from the house, that's not something you'll have to worry about. I used a 2x8 with a level to make sure I'm slightly sloped away from the house. Also, an important note, call 811 before you dig to avoid hitting any underground utility lines. Next step is to mark out the corners of your deck. I have 4 metal stakes for the 4 corners, and I made my own batter boards to help us find our square corners. I'm using our house as a reference point. We want the corner of the framing to be 1 inch away from the house, so I'm placing a stake here. We want the end of the deck to be in line with the window, so I placed another stake 1 inch away from the house here. For the other 2 corners, since I have more space to work with, I'm placing the batter boards just outside the corners of the deck. I tied a string from the stakes to each of the batter boards to connect every side. The string can be adjusted left and right on the batter board until your corners are square. You can use the 3-4-5 method to check your corners for square. Mark on one line 3 feet from the corner, mark on the other line 4 feet from the corner, and adjust the strings left and right until your diagonal measurement is 5 feet. Do this for every corner and then place a stake where these strings cross. Another way to check that your layout is square is to take a diagonal measurement. Step 3 is to mark out trenches. To make sure the trenches are dug nice and straight, I'm placing 2 stakes 12 inches in from each end of the deck and placing 2 stakes directly in the center. I laid some scrap wood strips in a straight line to connect my measurements. Then I used some spray paint to mark a line in the dirt as a guide for my shovel. We need the top of our deck to be about 10 inches from the ground, which is a few inches lower than the patio door threshold. We're using 2x8 lumber for our framing, which is 7.5 inches tall. The deck blocks are 7 inches tall, then the top decking is about 1 inch, so that puts us at 15.5 inches. With this information, we know that we're going to have to dig our deck blocks down into the ground about 5 inches. We'll end up digging trenches for our deck blocks at about 7 inches to account for 2 inches of paver sand. With the deck being 10 inches off the ground, that's a little too tall without needing a step. Your step up shouldn't be more than 7 3/4 of an inch, but we're going to be planting grass around the perimeter of the deck and adding some extra dirt so that it will only end up being a 7 to 8 inch step. We had to be pretty precise with the height of our deck to fit under the door. If you're building your floating deck away from the house in your yard, you'll have less restrictions for deck height, which will make it a bit easier. Step 4, dig trenches for deck blocks. The trenches should be at least a few inches wider than your deck blocks. You don't want to dig them too wide or you're going to have to fill them with extra paver base, and you don't want to make them too narrow because you may need some wiggle room to adjust your deck blocks left and right. I dug out the trenches using my spray painted line as a guide for my shovel. Like I said, I'm digging our trenches down about 7 inches, then filling the trench with a few inches of paver base to keep my deck blocks from settling. We found out our sprinkler system runs through the very end of the deck, unfortunately. Things were going way too smooth. It's never a DIY project without some problem, right? We turned off the water supply for the sprinkler system. I cut the PVC, dried the tubing, applied some primer to the tubing and cap, applied glue to the tubing and cap, then pressed the cap on nice and tight. We're going to reroute the irrigation later on, but for now, problem solved. Step 5, check trenches for level and height. Once your trenches are dug, place a few deck blocks and framing members in line with your trenches and across the trenches to check for level. It doesn't need to be perfect now, just get somewhere close. You also want to double check height to see if you need to dig the trench any lower and calculate how many inches of paver base should be laid down. Like I said, we're using our patio door threshold as a reference for height. We wanted the deck to end up a few inches lower than the patio door threshold, so we made sure the back row of the deck blocks by the house were level first and then worked our way down. Step 6, install weed barrier. To prevent weeds and grass from coming through the bottom of your deck, stake down rows of weed barrier. Step 7, lay paver base. To keep the deck from settling, we added about a 2-inch layer of paver base in the trenches. After the paver base is laid, we used a tamper to tamp down the paver base. Step 8, measure and mark out joists. I'm going to measure and mark out these rim joists and center joist. The 12-foot joists will be secured in place temporarily with exterior grade framing screws, and then we will go back and secure the joist hangers to each end of every joist. We're using Trex composite decking, which is secured to the framing with hidden fasteners, so the fasteners won't be visible. If you are securing your decking through the face with standard screws, you may not want to stagger your joists like this, otherwise your screws won't be lined up straight. Just something to think about before you start framing. I mentioned earlier that we're using treated 2x8 lumber for the framing, so I'm going to lay out 3 good 2x8s, square off each end, and then cut them to length. I'm marking the joists 16 inches on center. Since the joists are going to be staggered, I marked out the measurements on 2 of the boards, flipped my middle board over, shifted my measurements 1.5 inches over, and then transferred those measurements to the next 2 sides. Step 9, level paver base. Your paver base needs to be level or else your deck won't be level. And I'll be honest, this is a time-consuming process, especially with a deck this size. It takes a lot of small adjustments to get the height just right. I started by getting the center joist level and set where I wanted it, and then worked out from there. You may need to add some paver base or take some away in order to make your framing level. If your deck is attached to your house, or in our case right next to it, your deck should have a slope. It's best if your deck has a slope of about 1/8 inch per foot to ensure that water flows away from your home. If you have a floating deck that doesn't touch your home, you don't need a sloping deck because the direction of the water flow doesn't affect your house. After getting the paver base set under 4 deck blocks in each row, we filled in the rest of the trench to match. Step 10, layout center and exterior joists. Now we can finally start framing. To secure the framing, I'm using 3-inch exterior grade framing screws. With the center joist in place, we decided to install these 4 joists next. Our left and right rim joists are cantilevered, so we needed these 4 joists installed first to hold them up. After those 4 framing members were secured, we were able to secure all the exterior framing members. We had to get a little creative with securing these with the house in the way. We found it easier to assemble a few of the exterior framing pieces in the grass and then set them in place. As we secured each piece, we double checked for level and adjusted the deck blocks as we went if needed. When installing all your joists, make sure that the crowns are facing up. Make sure the crowns facing up. Before going further, we took a diagonal measurement to make sure we're still square. At this stage, we're still able to push the framing a bit to get our corners square before the framing gets too heavy. We doubled up the joists on each of the cantilevered ends, and now we've got all the exterior pieces framed. Step 11, frame interior joists. Now that the exterior joists are installed, we can fill in all the interior joists. We set the deck blocks in place first. We had to adjust the deck blocks a bit as we went so that the interior joists were nice and flush with the center and outside rim joists. You never know if your joists are all the same height. Usually there are minor differences, so it's better not to pre-attach the joist hangers. For now, I used 3-inch exterior grade framing screws, and then I will come back and secure joist hangers in the next step. Once again, when installing all your joists, make sure that the crown's facing up. Step 12, install joist hangers and corner brackets. Now that everything is framed, I'm going back in with the Simpson strong tie joist hangers for every single joist. To secure the joist hangers, I'm using 2.5-inch exterior grade wood screws and 10D 1.5-inch galvanized nails. For the doubled up end joists, I used corner brackets and 1.5-inch exterior grade screws. Next step is to install blocking. Adding blocking will provide extra support to your joists and help minimize bouncing in your deck. We staggered blocking in between every joist and added additional blocking at the cantilevered ends. Step 14, build up trenches with sand. This next step is probably overkill, but we got a bunch of sand and mounded up the trenches a bit. We just don't want to chance water pooling up near the deck blocks and our deck settling. Step 15, add protective joist tape. Last but not least, we added this protective joist tape to the top of every joist to prevent water damage. Before adding decking, you may want to consider installing some sort of mesh or fencing so that rodents can't sneak under your deck. And that is it on framing a floating deck. In the next video, we will be installing the Trex composite decking, and I'm excited to show you the deck completely finished. I will also supply a full list of tools and materials for the entire deck project, as well as a cost breakdown in that next video. So stay tuned, and thank you guys so much for watching.